Can a movie fail so badly that Hollywood gives up on it, only for history to crown it a masterpiece decades later? In the 1960s, some films were too strange, too dark, too artistic, or simply too ahead of their time for ordinary audiences. They lost money, confused critics, and disappeared fast. But then late-night viewers, film lovers, and cult fans brought them back. And the biggest failure on this list nearly destroyed a legendary career. Number 15, The Party, 1968. A single wrong step, one spilled drink, and suddenly Hollywood's most elegant party turns into total social collapse. The Party was not the kind of comedy that screamed classic when it first arrived. Audiences in 1968 were living through a decade of political anger, cultural rebellion, and darker, sharper movies. Then came this strange, delicate, mostly physical comedy starring Peter Sellers as Hrundi Fi Bakshi, an accident-prone Indian actor accidentally invited to a fancy Hollywood gathering. The film did not explode into box office legend, and critics were divided because its humor felt old-fashioned to some and awkward to others. But that is exactly why it later found its cult. The Party is not built like a normal comedy. It moves like a slow-burning disaster machine, where one tiny embarrassment creates another, until the whole mansion becomes a playground of chaos. Over time, fans began to admire its timing, silence, visual jokes, and oddball rhythm. It became a favorite for viewers who love comedy that does not need constant punchlines. The punchy truth? The Party was not too small. It was too weirdly graceful for its moment. Number 14, The Innocents, 1961. Some horror films scream at you, but this one whispers so quietly that you start doubting your own eyes. The Innocents arrived in 1961 as a ghost story, but not the kind that gives audiences easy shocks. Based on Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, it follows a governess who becomes convinced that two children are being haunted by dark forces inside a lonely country estate. At the time, its quiet approach made it harder to sell as a mainstream horror hit. There were no monsters crashing through windows, no cheap thrills, no simple answers. Instead, the film used silence, candlelight, shadows, and psychological pressure to make viewers feel trapped inside uncertainty. Was the house haunted, or was the governess slowly losing control? That question became the film's secret weapon. Over the years, horror fans and critics returned to it and realized how elegant, frightening, and deeply unsettling it was. Its influence can be felt in later psychological horror films that understand fear is often stronger when it stays half-hidden. The Innocents did not need loud terror to survive. It became a cult classic because its ghosts never truly left the room. Number 13, Onibaba, 1964. This is not just a horror film, it feels like a nightmare crawling out of tall grass. Onibaba, released in 1964, was a Japanese film that many Western audiences did not fully discover at first. It tells the story of two women surviving during a brutal period of war by killing wounded samurai and selling their armor. That setup alone is harsh, but the film becomes something deeper, a story about hunger, jealousy, desire, fear, and punishment. Its world is simple but terrifying. Endless reeds, sweaty nights, masked figures, and the feeling that nature itself is watching. For audiences expecting ordinary horror, Onibaba may have felt strange, slow, or too foreign in style. But later, cult horror fans and world cinema lovers embraced it as one of the most atmospheric films of the decade. Its famous demon mask became more than an image. It became a symbol of guilt and human darkness. The film's power comes from how little it explains and how much it makes you feel. Onibaba was not designed for easy comfort. It survived because it understood something timeless. Real horror begins when survival strips people down to their worst instincts. Number 12, Head, 1968. Few movies have ever tried so hard to destroy the very image that was supposed to sell them. Head, released in 1968, was supposed to be a film starring the Monkees, a band many people saw as light, fun, and manufactured for television. But instead of giving fans a simple musical comedy, The movie delivered a surreal, anti-commercial, self-mocking explosion of strange images, war footage, studio satire, psychedelic editing, and pop culture confusion. The result was box office disaster. Teen fans were confused. Older counterculture audiences did not fully accept the monkeys as serious rebels, and the marketing had no idea what kind of movie it was selling. But that failure is exactly what made Head fascinating later. Over time, viewers began to see it as a bizarre time capsule of the late 60s, a film attacking fame, television, consumer culture, and even its own stars. It feels less like a normal movie and more like a band trying to escape the machine that created them. Head bombed because it betrayed expectations. It became a cult classic because that betrayal was the whole point. Number 11. Seconds, 1966. What if you could buy a new face, a new life, and a second chance, only to discover the dream is another prison? Seconds, released in 1966, was far too cold, strange, and disturbing for many mainstream audiences at the time. Directed by John Frankenheimer, it follows a middle-aged banker who secretly undergoes a radical procedure to become a new man, played by Rock Hudson. But this is not a glamorous fantasy about reinvention. It is a nightmare about identity, regret, youth culture, and the terrifying emptiness behind the American dream. The film's black and white photography is harsh and distorted, with unsettling camera angles that make ordinary rooms feel like traps. Audiences expecting a conventional thriller did not know what to do with it, and its box office performance reflected that confusion. But decades later, Seconds found exactly the audience it needed. Viewers drawn to paranoid cinema, psychological horror, and stories about people crushed by systems pretending to save them. Rock Hudson's performance also gained new layers with time. Seconds failed because it made reinvention look horrifying. Today, that is why it feels so modern. It is not just a cult classic, it is a warning wearing a human face. Number 10. The Trial, 1962. Some movies do not feel watched. They feel like being accused of something you cannot understand. The Trial, released in 1962, was Orson Welles' haunting adaptation of Franz Kafka's famous novel, and it was never built to be an easy commercial success. Instead of offering a clean story with clear answers, it throws the viewer into a nightmare of endless corridors, strange offices, shadowy authorities, and a man trapped inside a legal system that never explains his crime. Anthony Perkins plays Joseph K. with nervous intensity, making the film feel like a psychological maze. At the time, audiences looking for traditional drama may have found it too abstract, too cold, or too confusing. It did not become a mainstream hit, but over time, its reputation grew. Film lovers began to admire its massive sets, surreal atmosphere, and terrifying sense of modern bureaucracy. The Trial now feels prophetic, as if Wells saw a world where people could be swallowed by systems, paperwork, suspicion, and invisible power. Its failure makes sense commercially, but artistically, it feels unavoidable. The Trial was not made to comfort audiences. It was made to haunt them. Number 9, Carnival of Souls, 1962. Some films do not scare you with monsters. They scare you by making the whole world feel slightly dead. Carnival of Souls, released in 1962, was made on a tiny budget with the strange, lonely atmosphere of a nightmare nobody can explain. It follows Mary Henry, a young woman who survives a car accident and then drifts into a new life that never feels quite real. She sees a pale, silent figure watching her, hears church organ music that sounds like it belongs in a funeral, and finds herself drawn toward an abandoned amusement pavilion that feels less like a building and more like a doorway. When it first appeared, the film did not become a major box office success. It slipped through the cracks like many low-budget horror films of the era, treated as disposable drive-in material instead of serious cinema. But later, television screenings, midnight audiences, and horror fans discovered its eerie power. The film's rough edges became part of its spell. Its emptiness, strange pacing, and ghostly imagery influenced generations of filmmakers who understood that fear does not always need blood. Sometimes, fear is a woman walking through a city where no one seems to see her. Carnival of Souls failed quietly, then returned like the ghost it always was. Number 8, The Loved One, 1965. Hollywood tried to laugh at death, and audiences did not know whether to laugh back or run for the exit. The Loved One, released in 1965, was sold as a comedy, but it was not the warm, friendly kind. It was a savage black satire about the funeral business, celebrity culture, artificial beauty, and the strange way America can turn even grief into a polished commercial product. Based on Evelyn Waugh's novel, the film follows a young Englishman entering a bizarre Los Angeles world where death is packaged with luxury, manners, and absurd ceremony. At the time, this was a difficult sell. The humor was sharp, cold, and uncomfortable, and its attack on Hollywood-adjacent culture may have felt too bitter for mainstream audiences. Instead of becoming a broad hit, it became one of those strange 60s artifacts people either rejected or remembered with fascination. Later viewers began to appreciate how fearless it was. The film's weird tone, grotesque characters, and almost cartoonish funeral empire made it feel ahead of its time, especially in an age obsessed with image and branding. The Loved One did not fail because it lacked jokes. It failed because its funniest idea was also its darkest. Even death can be turned into show business. Number 7, The Producers, 1967. A comedy about making money from failure almost failed before audiences understood the joke. The Producers, released in 1967, was Mel Brooks's outrageous debut, and its premise was dangerously bold. Two desperate theater men plan to create the worst Broadway musical imaginable so they can profit when it closes instantly. The result is Springtime for Hitler, one of the most shocking comic concepts of its era. Today, people know The Producers as a comedy landmark, but its early path was rough. Some audiences were stunned, some critics were unsure, and the film's humor was so aggressive that it did not immediately feel safe, polite, or commercial. It was not the kind of comedy that gently asked permission. It kicked down the door, laughed at bad taste, and dared viewers to admit it was funny. Over time, television, revival screenings, and word of mouth transformed it into a cult favorite. People began to see the genius behind the chaos. Zero Mostel's volcanic energy, Gene Wilder's nervous brilliance, and Brooks's fearless instinct for turning offense into satire. The Producers became legendary because it understood failure better than success. Its original release struggled, but history gave it the biggest laugh of all. Number 6, The Swimmer, 1968. A handsome man walks through sunny backyard pools, and somehow it becomes one of the saddest nightmares of the decade. The Swimmer, released in 1968, starred Burt Lancaster as Ned Merrill, a wealthy suburban man who decides to swim home by crossing one neighbor's pool after another. At first, the idea sounds elegant, even playful. But with each pool, the mood darkens. Conversations become colder. Memories contradict him. Friends turn distant. The bright American dream begins to rot under the sunlight. Audiences at the time struggled with the film because it did not behave like a normal drama. It was surreal, symbolic, emotionally uncomfortable, and difficult to market. Was it a social satire? A psychological breakdown? A tragedy disguised as leisure? Its box office failure was not surprising because mainstream viewers were not prepared for a film that turned suburbia into a haunted landscape. But later, cult audiences and critics embraced its strange power. Lancaster's performance gained new respect because he plays confidence slowly collapsing into humiliation. The Swimmer now feels like one of the sharpest attacks on status, denial, and middle-class fantasy in 60s cinema. It failed because viewers expected a story about freedom. What they got was a man drowning on dry land. Number 5, Targets, 1968. The old horror movie monster was dying, and the new monster was standing in broad daylight with a rifle. Targets, released in 1968, was one of the most unsettling films of its moment because it understood that horror itself was changing. On one side, it features Boris Karloff as an aging horror star, a symbol of Gothic castles, shadows, and old-fashioned screen terror. On the other side, it follows a clean-cut young man who quietly becomes a mass shooter. That contrast made the film disturbing in a way audiences were not fully ready to process. It was not escapist horror. It was modern fear, pulled from newspapers and placed right beside Hollywood fantasy. Because of its subject matter, modest release, and uncomfortable realism, Targets did not become a major box office success. But later, it became a cult essential, especially for fans of smart, low-budget, socially aware thrillers. Peter Bogdanovich's direction gives the film a chilling split identity, part farewell to classic horror, part warning about violence in modern America. Its final drive-in sequence is still haunting because it turns movie watching itself into a trap. Targets failed commercially because it was too close to real life. Today, that is exactly why it still feels dangerous. Number 4. Point Blank, 1967. This is not a revenge movie. It is a man walking through the ruins of his own death. Point Blank, released in 1967, looked on the surface like a hard crime thriller. Lee Marvin plays Walker, a betrayed criminal who survives being shot and left for dead, then tears through a cold criminal organization to recover the money owed to him. But the film was far stranger than a simple payback story. Director John Borman turned the plot into a fractured, icy, almost ghost-like journey through modern Los Angeles, where glass towers, empty rooms, echoing footsteps, and sudden violence made the whole city feel emotionally dead. Audiences expecting a straightforward action picture may have been confused by its jagged editing, dreamlike structure, and strange sense that Walker might not even be fully alive. It did not become the kind of mainstream hit its star power suggested, but later, it found a passionate cult following because it felt so ahead of its time. Point Blank helped reshape the crime film by making revenge feel psychological, abstract, and almost existential. Lee Marvin's performance is brilliant because he does less, not more. He moves like a machine powered by betrayal, and every silence feels threatening. The film's impact can be felt in later neo-noir thrillers that treat crime not as glamour, but as emotional decay. Point Blank did not fail because it lacked force. It failed because its force was too cold, too modern, and too strange for audiences expecting ordinary gunfire. Number 3. Peeping Tom, 1960. One camera, one killer, and one scandal so vicious it helped bury a great director's career. Peeping Tom, released in 1960, is now seen as one of the most important psychological horror films ever made, but at the time, it was treated almost like a crime against good taste. The story follows Mark Lewis, a disturbed cameraman who films women at the moment of their deaths, turning cinema itself into something frightening, voyeuristic, and morally uncomfortable. Audiences and critics were not ready for a film that forced them to question why they watched horror in the first place. Instead of hiding behind shadows and monsters, Peeping Tom made the camera the weapon, the viewer the accomplice, and the act of looking the real terror. The backlash was brutal, and Michael Powell, once respected for elegant British classics, saw his reputation badly damaged. Commercially and critically, the film seemed poisoned. But decades later, filmmakers, critics, and horror scholars returned to it and realized how far ahead it was. Its ideas about surveillance, obsession, media violence, and the dangerous intimacy of images feel more modern now than they did in 1960. What once seemed too disturbing became prophetic. Peeping Tom did not simply bomb, it was punished for seeing the future too clearly. Its cult status came from a painful truth. Sometimes, the audience rejects a mirror because it shows them something they do not want to admit. Number 2, Playtime, 1967. Jacques Tati built an entire city for a comedy, and nearly lost everything because audiences could not find the joke fast enough. Playtime, released in 1967, was one of the most ambitious films of the decade, and maybe one of the riskiest comedies ever attempted. Instead of relying on a simple plot, Tati created a massive modern world of glass buildings, offices, restaurants, airports, reflections, crowds, machinery, and tiny human mistakes. The famous set, often called Tativille, was enormous, expensive, and almost absurdly detailed. But that ambition became the film's commercial curse. Mainstream audiences expecting easy laughs from Monsieur Hulot found something much stranger: a widescreen visual maze where jokes happened in corners, background spaces, reflections, and movements so subtle that viewers had to search for them. The film was costly, difficult to market, and financially disastrous for Tati. Yet over time, Playtime became one of cinema's great rediscovered masterpieces. Critics and cult audiences began to understand that the film was not just comedy, it was a brilliant satire of modern life, where humans try to survive inside systems built to make everything efficient, shiny, and emotionally empty. Its restaurant sequence alone feels like civilization slowly falling apart in formal wear. Playtime failed because it asked audiences to watch differently. Today, that is exactly why it matters. It is not a comedy you consume. It is a world you enter, study, and eventually surrender to. Number 1, Night of the Living Dead, 1968. What happens when a movie so ahead of its time is dismissed as nothing more than a gory B-film? Night of the Living Dead, released in 1968, was far more than just the first modern zombie film. It was a statement about survival, fear, and social collapse. Directed by George A. Romero, the film follows a group of people trapped in a house as the dead rise, slowly turning the world into an apocalyptic nightmare. Despite its groundbreaking concepts, shockingly violent scenes, and eerie atmosphere, it was dismissed by many upon release as too low-budget and too disturbing for mainstream audiences. But over time, its true genius became undeniable. Not only did it introduce a new horror genre, but it also embedded deep social commentary on race, class, and human nature. The film became a cult classic, and its initial failure now seems ironic, given that it eventually spawned a franchise, influencing everything from pop culture to real-life zombie survival kits. Night of the Living Dead didn't just fail because it was violent or low-budget. It failed because it asked uncomfortable questions about humanity's ability to survive in the face of chaos. Today, it's regarded as one of the most important horror films ever made. So which of these failures deserved better from the very beginning? The strange truth is, the 60s did not just produce hits, it produced misunderstood films that had to wait years for the right audience. If one of these cult classics shocked you, drop its name in the comments, hit like, and subscribe for more forgotten movie stories Hollywood got wrong.